Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English listeners, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today I am glad to talk to Joe Cohen. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And for those that don't know you, you're you could say an expert in. We talked about this. I used to say like psychoanalysis, but it's more psychodynamic vision of the world, you could say, and what all that means. We're going to get into a second. But what we're going to talk about today is, I guess, something that everyone, in a sense, can relate to. It is we have our modern societies, especially in the West, and we tend to think in these societies in our individual things that we do, but there are also, you could say, psychological structures underlying the society that have an impact on all of us. So therefore, I'm happy that we can have a hopeful, meaning conversation about it. But before we go into actually what's happening in society, maybe it's also nice for people to get to know you a little bit. Like I said already, I use the term psychodynamic and psychoanalysis. I think for many people that might be unfamiliar with this, it sounds kind of complicated. So maybe you can explain how you got involved in all of this, and also maybe what the difference is from your perspective.
Sure. First of all, I would actually like to say the word expert is quite an interesting word, because I wouldn't say that I'm an expert because so many people have different opinions. But I'm deeply interested and engaged and thoughtful about what it is that drives our behaviors. And I got involved in this really when I was raising my children, because I observed some what I would call sort of curious behavior within families and parents. I felt that it was becoming increasingly difficult for parents to set boundaries for their children. And so children were being given what I would regard as inappropriate freedoms. They were getting involved with things they shouldn't be and weren't developmentally ready for, in drugs and alcohol and sexual behavior, because the parents seemed to find it difficult to set those boundaries. And I thought that was quite curious. So I decided that I needed to train in this. And I trained in group psychoanalysis because I thought that this was really a group phenomenon. It wasn't just one person. It seemed to be, a kind of trend. And I qualified as a group work practitioner, which is not a full group analyst, but it's with some of the conceptions that underlie it. And I used that then to volunteer in the youth offending system, where I worked with families and young people who had committed offences, but they were not being imprisoned for them. But the idea was to agree in conversation what was causing the offending behaviour, and to agree interventions and contract interventions to change the behaviour. But what I discovered was a very similar thing, which is that those boundaries were not clear. And we were dealing very often with immigrant families who really didn't come from the same environment culturally that we did, and had very different ideas about the way to be in the world. So there was a sort of parallel happening here. And I thought, well, that's deserves more investigation. So then I decided to train in individual psychodynamic psychotherapy. And to answer your question about, what is the difference between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic, they both come from the same thesis, which is that the psyche is a dynamic system. It's not just one thing, it's aspects of consciousness that interact with each other to produce experience. And that started with Freud. We know him as the father of psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis is a very in-depth dive, really, into very early experiences that are understood to structure the psyche. Whereas in psychodynamic work, we work less intensively and much more more in what we call the here and now, which is what is happening in the room between the counsellor and the client. And the counsellor tries to understand from the way that the client interacts with them what's underpinning their reactions and their responses.
Very interesting. Just if we take a step back, there might maybe it's a simple question, but why should people care about what psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy, what it has to say about people, about the world? I think that might be a question that people might be thinking right now.
What is the interface between the individual and society, do you mean? Or why does it matter what sort of psychotherapy is? Sorry, I wasn't. Yeah.
I would say even more fundamentally, why should people care about psychotherapy to begin with? I think a lot of people have kind of given up trust about therapy in general. I think psychotherapy is getting less trust every year. There are many reasons for that. We might go into some of that later, but what do you think is the relevance to this conversation for your average person who just has a busy life and maybe wants to understand a little bit something about himself or about society that he or she lives in? But how do you look at that?
I think that's a really important question. And I would agree with you that people are losing trust in psychotherapy, and it's something that we can definitely talk about. But the importance of it is really the cohesion of the individual and of the self, and the cohesion of society. Because when people are not functioning, and there are levels of not functioning, there can be the person who feels extremely anxious and depressed, but is nonetheless able to be working and may not appear to be anxious and depressed, but finds daily life really difficult, right down to those who are really extremely disordered and, in worst case scenarios can actually, really damage society in really material ways. But I think we would all believe in the desire for human flourishing and the good, and the desire to actually help people to exist and express themselves fully in the world. That's certainly my motivation. I think each individual has the capacity to give to society and to receive, and that one I think we would probably all agree that we'd want to facilitate that.
I do think that's a good point. And as someone coming, of course, from the Netherlands, we over here, I think especially the last 2.5, 3 decades, we have had this dominant view that, as long as you don't harm other people, then you can do whatever you want. This, I think, has been the common liberal or neoliberal phrase that we see everywhere. So, as I already mentioned in the beginning, when we were going to talk about psychological structures of society, maybe it's good, first of all, to go into what it actually means. But second of all, from that perspective, people might not even be convinced that there are such things to begin with, right? As people have this very individualistic approach. So maybe we should also talk a little bit about how this can actually impact people that might be underestimating this.
This is sort of one of my favorite subjects, actually, because I see human beings and the way we behave almost in the sense of fractal geometry, because human beings in one way are individual, but in another way we cannot exist outside of society. And in fact, the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott had this very well-known phrase that there is no such thing as a baby. And what he meant by that is that the baby simply cannot exist without the mother to feed, nourish, and look after the baby. So right from the very earliest moments of life, we are interconnected with other people. And if we think about those relationships that we develop, from birth onwards, and then how those interactions are shaped by those early experiences, and how our interactions throughout life will then impact those with whom we connect, we can see almost like a ripple effect, which creates the fabric of a society, if you like. But again, as this is a sort of, I suppose, an expanding proposition, there have to be some common ties that hold people together. And there's a group analyst who was, a pioneer in the understanding of a psychotherapy based around groups called S.H. Fulks. And he conceptualized this as a matrix. And he talked about us being in matrices of relationships and those aspects of experience that contribute to that matrix. So we all bring a personal matrix of relationships from our families, but then we also have dynamic matrices as we go through life and meet other people and interact. And they sit on a foundation of a commonality of understanding, which is really shaped by traditions, by our norms, by our values, and our familiarities. And on that basis, we can exchange, we can resonate, we can mirror, we can understand each other. And then we have a functional condition where we're sufficiently safe in our sense of self that we can actually function in a productive way. But when we feel threatened, when those structures are, sort of threatened by, like, for example, at the moment, huge seismic world event changes, then we don't operate functionally in that way.
I think there's a lot to unpack there. When you talk about this matrix, let me see if I get you right, and with me maybe also the audience. You have different matrices, like you said. You have you could say your social fundamental matrix, like your family. You have matrix that can change. The friends come and go, as they say. You have other matrix that we share even as a group. You could say the cultural and other values, and all of these together creates, you could say, some stability for people. Is that what you are saying?
I am, but I'm sort of being a bit more almost technical than that. It's that the interrelationships, the way that we exchange information, not conscious. What I haven't explained actually are the basic psychoanalytic understandings of how we interpret the world, which perhaps it would be helpful if I explain that, because that might explain a bit better what I mean by a matrix. Freud's understanding of the unconscious, because the whole basis of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy rests on the existence of an unconscious area of experience and processing. His understanding of it is three aspects. There is the id, which are our biological needs and drives, and they drive us in individualistic survival ways. But because we don't exist in isolation of other people, we internalize the demands and the prohibitions of the outside world. And he called that the superego. And he understood that as almost the basis of conscience that restricts our actions. And those two almost, they are conflicting drives. What we want and what we have to do to survive are mediated by the managing director, which is the ego. So the ego decides which parts of those conflicts are too unbearable to think about, and the ego then represses them, pushes them away into the unconscious, where we don't have to think about them because they're too uncomfortable. But there are a whole range of processes that keep them repressed. And that's very important, because those are the processes that really connect us to other people, because they involve in a productive way the capacity to imprint from other people an alternative point of view. It enables us to, as I said, to exchange. But when they are dysfunctional, we start using other people as objects in which to discard those aspects of ourselves that are too uncomfortable to think about. So we might split and make some people all bad and others all good, just because it's more comfortable to be able to think only about the good and get rid of the rest. And we can see that socially. They call it polarization, but really it's just a split. You're really bad, you're really good. We use projections if we're feeling particularly vulnerable, and that's a very uncomfortable feeling, we might make somebody else appear to be vulnerable so that we can look after them, which is a way of looking after ourselves, but they may not actually be vulnerable in the real world. We can deny things we don't want to know, which plays out in, free speech debates. Some people just simply deny the possibility of an alternative opinion because it's just too uncomfortable. They can't conceive of it because it's too destabilizing. So those are just examples.
That's a good point. And I think also when you talk about discomfort, I think if there's one thing that we have been championing in the modern world is trying to unaccept basically the simple fact of life that it can be uncomfortable at points. So we're not as good anymore, if we ever were, to be fair, but we're not training dealing with discomfort, I would say. And that brings us also to maybe a fundamental point. You're talking about polarization and these other you would say surface level effects that you see now due to these underlying problems or tensions that we have with ourselves and our surroundings. But of course, our society also has changed and is still changing quite rapidly. What would you say, if you look at how humanity for the longest period of time in the pre-modern era, how it has dealt with, you could say, this tension between the superego and the it, but compared to how we do it now in modern society? What would you say about that?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm not a historian, and I don't, so I can only take some sort of broad brush, understandings. But really, the critical factor that I think we're discussing is the boundary, and it's the boundary between ourselves and the other. And I would suggest that boundary was very firmly understood, and having a firmly, held boundary meant that suffering became a reality because we couldn't cross it, and there might be things on the other side that we want and discomforts that we would like to get rid of. And if you can't because there's a boundary, then you have to deal with the reality. But I'm not suggesting that means, I am suggesting that we need much better boundaries, but I'm not suggesting that we just abandon people to suffer on the other side of the boundary. Our project has got to be to equip people to cope, with the uncertainties that go with the boundary. How that was dealt with in pre-modern society, I don't know. But what I would suggest is that from the Enlightenment onwards, this idea of the individual as existing, the idea that we can break things down into a rationalized understanding, works very well for the actual sciences, but in social terms, it's more problematic. And then I think the Romantic movement really focused attention on the experience of the self and the sensual contact with the world. But then that became an inward-looking focus. And then psychoanalysis itself, is both an inward-looking focus, but it's also scientific. I think Freud did, in fact, regard it as a scientific sort of project. I think scientific is the right word in a science environment. But there's a historian called Christopher Lasch who wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism at the end of the 1970s, early 80s, in which he thought about this inward-looking focus as producing a form of narcissism because it lost that boundary. It lost that sense of an environment, a container, effectively, in which we function. And I would suggest that the kind of narcissistic anxieties and defenses that we use today sort of emerge from that move to an inward space, deeply exacerbated by world events.
Yes, in a sense, it seems ironic, right? In a sense, we have lost one boundary. As you were saying, even in some small examples of like parents and with their children. In another sense, we have another boundary that emerged, like you're saying now, which is the very large boundary that now seems to exist between the individual and its environment, as if they're completely separate from each other. So I'm curious what you think about this. I think as you're saying, there might be some truth in this, you could say, overindulgence in looking inside. But in a sense, at least from my experience, psychoanalysis, like you were saying yourself, does this quite a lot. So maybe to the playing devil's advocate, a difficult question, but don't you think then you could also make the argument that psychoanalysis could be part of the problem that's causing this boundary between the individual and its environment?
It's so interesting because I completely agree with you, but it's a paradox because if we go back to what I explained earlier about those defense mechanisms that we employ in those conditions of anxiety, a psychoanalyst called Melanie Klein, she codified these into 2 stages of development, and she called them positions because the baby employs these very early defenses, which she called paranoid schizoid position, when those defenses are absolutely, the most sort of directive process by which we live. But theoretically, by going through that in the condition of containment, when we have a mother who can hold those anxieties, who can digest the envies, the hatreds, the rages of the infant, that anybody who's had children will recognize, the screaming toddler, etc., holding that then allows the developing child to recognize that they can exist in a boundaried world. And the problem is that we don't have a boundaried world. And I think you're absolutely right that in the process of trying to be empathetic, what we've actually created with the loss of that boundary is a complete loss of containment. And I think it's so spread and diffuse that even leaders are not able any longer to hold those rages. So what your suggestion that we just stick the boundary back again and that's going to solve the problem, it won't, because in order for it to work, there has to be an integrated psyche that has transcended that into the depressive position and can tolerate those ambivalences and uncertainties that are part of daily life, because they've understood through development that they're not going to vanish and disappear in the course of experiencing those uncomfortable feelings. And we have not actually achieved that yet. I think people feel really anxious. So to stick a boundary back could achieve the opposite. Could do. I don't know.
That is fair. Some food for thought that pops up in my mind when you're saying this also is one thing that I've studied a little bit about pre-modern society is also the fact that when you talk about these defense mechanisms or even coping mechanisms to deal with these defense mechanisms, then there used to be this basic acceptance that it's quite difficult for people to deal with them alone. And as they're not just an individual, they don't have to. You could say a lot of the thing that people talk about when they talk about traditions is you could say intersubjective coping mechanisms to also deal with these troubling things. And I would argue that we have kind of lost a lot of these traditions. And people, like if I take the Dutch perspective, one of our most important traditions is Sinterklaas, and people can rarely articulate why it is very important for people, besides the nostalgia of when they were young themselves. But you could argue that these kind of celebrations are also a way of dealing with these things that the defense mechanism also deal with on an individual level. So I'm curious about how you think, if you agree, and how that would fit into the discussion we're having.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that these symbolic, ritualistic environments are a way in which we can collectively experience, trouble and strife in a universal, within our environment context that makes sense of it. We discover that we are not alone, in this condition, and that is a container. That's a very holding environment. I would agree with that, but in order to achieve that, there has to be, to go back to this idea of the matrix, that Fuchs created, there has to be a foundation matrix where we all understand what we're doing. We need to know we're doing the same thing. And that comes out of a tradition and a shared sort of set of, norms, really. And what's happening in society is that in our desire to, embrace the other, we've somehow fantasized a common matrix, for want of a better word, that actually isn't there. And so we're hoping for something that is not really achievable in that way. Perhaps this is just a suggestion. That's one thing. But also we do seem to have really lost a lot of our rituals. You know, we those important rituals around death. We don't see. In fact, we just want to get rid of death altogether. You know, so the idea that we could mourn collectively in that way, which gives us the capacity to allow for death, doesn't really, you know, we really want to deny it more than anything. And I think COVID was an example, and the COVID response, the terror, you know, was, you know, interesting.
Definitely. And when you talk about the fact that we are thinking that we share these matrix with others, when in fact we don't, when it comes to values, etc., then are you talking, for example, in the European context, about the challenges of multiculturalism, or something else that you're specifically alluding to?
Well, I am talking about multiculturalism, but I think it's almost beyond that, in the sense that whatever the theory behind it is, even if we put the theory aside, we have now, people are moving around the globe all the time now. And we have to accept the reality that we have commonalities with others in certain ways, but in other ways, not at all. And so, well, however you want to frame it, there has to be a recognition, I believe, that in certain deep cultural contexts there are very big differences. And the question is, what do we do about that? How do we meet the other in these collective conditions in such a way that we can actually be productive and can flourish, rather than producing, going back to paranoid schizoid defense mechanisms?
Okay, maybe it's good if you explain what these kind of defense mechanisms are, because I think people might not be familiar with these terms. And maybe second of all, if you make it concrete for, you could say, your average person who doesn't have the time or energy to abstractly think about this all day, as maybe some scientists or intellectuals might do. What do you think that people can do in their own personal life, and how can they maybe even recognize in their own lives that this is playing maybe a bigger part, these issues, than also in relation to society, right? Than people might admit at first hand.
Right. So it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about just normal people trying to go about their daily lives, but feeling beset by anxieties, or the sense that somehow the world is against them, or that they're feeling invaded by, you know, large populations coming in, or even as simple as, you know, the boss at work is picking on them, we need to start thinking about, is this real? Is this reality, or is this a defensive reaction to something that we don't know how to deal with? So we might think that, you know, certain parts of the population are all bad. We don't want them. Let's get rid of them. Is that real, or is that actually we feel you know, we feel invaded in a context that doesn't belong in the here and now, that actually, in fact, I'm not explaining this very well. We might say they're all bad. We might group people together as being all bad because of some common characteristic, and that doesn't take account of their individuality. That would be a split. A projection would be to think that your boss is picking on you, whereas in fact the reality is that you hate your boss and he's not actually picking on you, and you'd actually like to pick on him. Those are very small examples. You know, people might be telling you something and you simply don't want to hear it. They're saying, you know, you're always picking the wrong type of partner. That's why your relationships always end in disaster, and you just don't want to know the real reasons why you keep going for somebody who's going to treat you badly. That's why you might want to go to therapy. I don't know if that's helpful.
I do think it's helpful, but let me make it even a little bit more challenging. Because one of the things that you said that resonates with me is the question: is this real or not? Right? The question is my boss picking on me, or is it a projection of me? We're getting in times that are increasingly complicated, unstable, changing. There are, if we're being honest, at least I think so. We're as a society, as a civilization, maybe even we're being challenged by other civilizations. So there's, as people like to say nowadays, this multipolar tension rising. So there actually are a lot of things changing that people, even from a psychologically healthy point of view, might be anxious about or have at least a response to. So that's happening at the one time, while at the same time we also have to deal with our own imperfection, right? So this becomes even more complicated to address what is real and what isn't real. How should people navigate that? You think, because at least it seems like a very big challenge.
You're absolutely right, and it's very, very difficult. But I think the ability to hold on to what we think ourselves and what we believe in ourselves is absolutely critical to this, and that is the mark of an integrated psyche. So when we have a sense of invasion by another, what we really have to interrogate is, how anxious am I? And if you're feeling very anxious about it, that would suggest that there is a because feelings are guides in this process. We have to think about, well, why is this so anxiety provoking? Maybe the truth is that actually we are being invaded, but actually I don't need to feel anxious about it. I simply need to put up the boundary and say, no, sorry, you can't come in. It's like somebody, in an individual context, knocking at your front door or trying to barge their way into your house, and you have the capacity to just shut the door. But instead of just shutting the door, in fact, you experience a great wave of panic because you don't know how you're going to deal with it. Those are the two different states. So the anxious state is when we're responding to these sort of early drivers, if you like. The integrated state is a state that says, yes, I recognize that this is a situation, but I have choices about how to deal with it.
And yeah, I do think it makes sense. I think on an individual level, there's no recipe for everyone that you can summarize in a few sentences, right? It's too complex for that on an individual basis. But I think another question that people might be asking, including me, is we're spending billions and billions of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever on policy to improve people's mental health, to have a whole industry of mental health, which is increasing. And at the same time, we see in all the numbers that actually the amount of people suffering from mental disorders, no matter if it's like something relatively small as anxiety or a light depression, all the way to more severe psychological problems. Why do you think we've been so unable, even though we have much more focus on it, we have much more resources on it, and yet it seems like we're failing more and more? Not to be too pessimistic, but that's at least what the statistics and the facts indicate, I would say.
I would completely agree with you. And I would suggest that the reason we can't deal with it is because it's completely systemic. The whole structures of society are, in one way, paranoid schizoid structures. They are not structures that actually put those boundaries in place. So, for example, in a school, where, for example, we might teach Hamlet or, Shakespeare, to deal with those very existential questions about how do we deal with the business of being and not being, for example. Instead of doing that, we teach happiness lessons or wellness lessons. So, which instead of acknowledging the reality of the complexity of suffering and the fact that it does exist and we have to find a response to it, we want to, in a paranoid schizoid way, project it away, deny that it exists, and just say, yes, you can be happy, you can be well. So that is, and that goes throughout society. Here we have a very famous case quite recently of the police turning up on somebody's doorstep for something called a non-crime hate incident.
Yes.
Which was the result of a tweet sent several years earlier. Meanwhile, somebody's handbag has been stolen or their bicycle's been stolen. So again, instead of concentrating on the acts themselves, we're so invested in averting vulnerability that we invest in the feelings of the other rather than the actual things that are happening. So our whole focus is skewed in every area of public life. So to deal with the mental health issues, we have to go much, much deeper, and it doesn't start in the consulting room or end there. It belongs right back at the beginnings of, of the family, society, and the way we construct our services, really.
Okay, before we go a little bit further, maybe there are people wondering, because you've used the word the term paranoid schizoid like quite a lot, and
yes,
for people that know, I also studied clinical psychology. For me, and also obviously for you, these are normal terms. But for many people, this is not something they hear in their daily life. They're not going to ask the neighbor if they dealt with anything paranoid schizoid today. So what does it actually mean? Maybe it's also, before we go for a little bit further, that's maybe a good question to ask.
I agree, and it's quite funny, really, because it is a very big, because we're dealing really with the unconscious. These are very difficult processes to understand, and the problem is, and I think this is why, and I think it's a very good example of why so many people don't know about the different types of therapy. It's because it's so complex that by the time you understand it, nobody can understand you. So it makes it very difficult. But what it means is that in those very early stages of development, the baby is in fear of its very survival. And that anxiety is so overwhelming and intense that it really feels death. And a way of putting that into a context is paranoid. That is a paranoid condition. We think that the world is out to get us, that actually if the breast that supplies the milk doesn't appear, it's an attack. It feels like that to the baby. And schizoid means splitting. It means when things are split up. So in the very earliest stages of development, the baby differentiates. It doesn't see the mother. What it sees is a breast that supplies when the pain of hunger, which is completely unfamiliar to a baby, attacks the baby from within. The breast appears and suddenly it all goes away. But then, of course, sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, that's an attacking, hateful object. And the paranoid feelings arise out of that. So the defense mechanisms that I've been talking about are all there to try to avoid these unbearable feelings. So that's what when we talk about paranoid schizoid, we're talking about those very early, deep, intense anxieties.
Yes, it's a fair point, I think. I think what people might be wondering, and something that I tend to also think about a lot, is, okay, so of course, if you're realistic, you cannot reshape society. So we have to deal with modern society for better or for worse. It brought quite some good things. It also brought, as we have been talking about now, also quite some challenges, not the least psychologically. But we're here now, so we have to deal with this world. We cannot. We can, of course, spend a lot of time imagining a different world, which people are allowed to do, of course. But I think for reality, it's maybe not the most interesting way to deal with. So, what do you think, from where we are right now? What are the ways to deal with these underlying issues that we have as society, these underlying psychological structures that are becoming, I would say, more rigid, it seems.
Yeah. So, as I hope I've managed to make clear, but maybe not, because these are so complex, the way that the baby transitions through to what we've called the depressive position, this ability to tolerate these uncertainties, requires the containing mother. And the way that works is that the mother allows the baby to experience disappointment, but only to such a point. And then it does come in, but it can tolerate all of those, those feelings. So what's happening in society that I've witness is we can't tolerate anything. So we always want to make it better. The screams of the hungry baby are unbearable. So rather than being able to tolerate it and then to feed back to the baby that they're still there, they're not going to die, that it's okay to scream and come through the other side, we just don't do that anymore. We just jump in straight away with a medical diagnosis. This is what you're suffering from. Take a pill, go into therapy, except that we can't provide enough therapy for that. But as I said, that capacity to just hold it isn't there. So we really do need to do that. And we need to just, when I read, what's happening, in a school curriculum that says we're going to teach a happiness lesson, we're going to teach an empathy lesson, I just sort of frizzle with horror and think, no, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to actually allow them to have a fight, and then to separate them, make sure that they're okay, and to show them that they've survived it. They have survived it. And that's the most important thing.
Yeah, that reminds me, of course, in psychology of this learned helplessness theory, right? Where if you don't do this, if you don't go through these experiences of actually knowing by experience that you can deal with it, then people go into this mode of that they learn, like it says already in the term, that they feel like they are unable to deal with any experience that life throws at them. So they have to, in a sense, withdraw from it at all. But I think to maybe challenge you a little bit is, for let's say new generations, we this might seem doable, but as we are growing up more and more in broken families and societies, where first of all you don't have role models to begin with, not your parents, quite often not other family members, communities are disappearing, so whoever can take the place of community, that is it's a big challenge. Even though in theory we might create this environment either naturally or even in a school setting, people when they get to this age, they already have quite a lot of detrimental experiences and brokenness there. So how do you think, if we go back also to the real world of our broken societies, how can we deal with that when not all these resources exist?
I mean, I think it's a real challenge, but I think the first thing we have to do is not to be afraid to apply that container. We have to be able to say no. We have to be able to recognize that there are some things that just won't be tolerated, and to bear it when we get kickback. And I think, what I would again suggest, in our condition, it's unbearable for those who are in charge to be able to say no. I mean, there's an organizational consultant called Anton Oppolzer, and he says that leadership is essentially about the management of change, and that the management of change requires power and authority, because consensus management doesn't work. And I think that's the reality, is that we have to accept that people need power and they need authority, and they need to be able to say no. I mean, if the parent doesn't have power and authority, I think all the children would be dead. They'd be sticking their fingers in plugs and doing all kinds of really dangerous things. We have to be able to say no. But then in the process of that, as you say, there's so much brokenness. We don't want to abandon people. So I this is just, it's not for me to provide solutions to this, but that reclamation of community, that capacity for this to be a joint endeavour, is really important, and communities can do this for each other. I mean, I've heard about mothers getting together to agree that their children can't have smartphones. That communities can actually affect change in this holding environment. And I think we need to really encourage that. And it spreads in just the same way that, paranoid schizoid conditions can spread. A more integrated condition could also hold and spread, you see. So I think, that's very important. And I think to remember we are not alone, that when we feel that we're alone, this is a collective condition that we've managed to somehow create, fall into, however we want to think about that. And I did, and actually would quite like, if you wouldn't mind, just to read this to you, because I think it's such an important quote, and it comes from a Scottish philosopher called John McMurray, and he wrote this in 1935, which I think is very significant. And he wrote, "All of us, if we are really alive, are disturbed now in our emotions. We are faced by emotional problems that we do not know how to solve. We shall make no headway with these questions unless we begin to see them and keep on seeing them, not as our private difficulties, but as the growing pains of a new world of human experience." And I think that's incredibly important, because it is a community enterprise. We are not alone.
When you talk about, the community, I think a lot of it, what it starts with is the smallest community, the family. When you talk about hierarchies, when you talk about power, when you talk about also authority, a lot of this also has to do, at least I think, also with a lot of change of how we perceive family structures, also how we see roles between men and women. And I guess since the 60s, this has changed radically, right? So how do you think, I think for many, this is a sensitive topic that people rather not talk about it, for reasons we have already discussed today, that it can be uncomfortable when there is a specific consensus. But what do you think, when we talk about authority, when we talk about these broken families? Definitely things have changed since we have different understandings of power, authority, in also family dynamics. How do you think, because you just said what communities can do, but what do you think we can do in understanding of the family life?
Well, I think, broken families are difficult and distressing and painful, but it doesn't mean they can't be functional, because broken suggests something irreparable, really. But actually, throughout history, families have existed in all kinds of shapes and forms and structures. You can have a single parent raising a child. There are different configurations, but the success of it is not so much to do with the external appearance of it, but the internal method by which we conduct it. And again, how we navigate that, we have to use our emotions as guides towards what's happening. So when we're feeling in a state of anxiety, that things are really not working, the discomfort comes from having to interrogate why. Why is this not working? So, for example, to go back to the very beginning of this conversation, when I mentioned about when I was watching families, finding it difficult to set boundaries, what was happening, as I said, is that the children were running out of control, which created more anxiety, more fear, less desire to let go and to allow independence. So it was a self-perpetuating circle, and the anxiety that the parents were feeling, at that point, they have to look at themselves, not their children. Why am I letting my children run riot? Why aren't I saying, no, you have a curfew? Well, it's the terror of the separation, of the rage, of the insecurity. And when you start to think about it, when you start to observe yourself in this condition and what you're doing and what your contribution is, it's deeply uncomfortable, but you do begin to see choices and solutions. Actually, I have to bear the rage of my child. I have to be hated temporarily, because children actually want to love their parents. So even if they hate you temporarily, that's really only because they love you.
That's an assurance, I think, for a lot of young parents. Last thing I want to address is another big elephant in the room of how the things have changed, is the role of technology, social media. When you talk about boundaries, you could say part of what has allowed people to think that we live in the world without boundaries is also the way we have information technology, communication technology. I mean, we're using it right now, right? We're not in the same room, not even the same country right now, but we're having this conversation. And at some point when this is published, people all over the world can watch it. So that in a sense already is breaking some boundaries, you could say. So how do you feel? Of course, there are many, I guess, studies, and there's now consensus on the dangers of social media, especially for young children. But it's a fundamental question of how also this technology plays its part in, having creating more tension for creating a world with boundaries.
Well, there's no question that is exactly what's happening. And we have to, again, as a carer, whether you're, I suppose, a prime minister, a teacher, or whoever you are, we have to actually acknowledge our duties and our responsibilities as well as our rights. And we have duties towards the other as they exist. And that means that we have duties to know what our children are doing, for example. We have a duty to know when they've got a smartphone, what they're doing with it. And it's not comfortable. It just isn't. And it's the easy option is to say, fine, they're off on the computer, they're doing this, that, or the other. But the consequence of that will be the creation of anxiety, because it will create problems. So again, it all begins with one's own self-interrogation, actually, to say, what are my feelings telling me? And a feeling could be as much, I can't be bothered, as it could be as I feel anxious. So all of those things need to be thought about.
Thank you. I must say, I think we have covered quite a lot. I hope also for the listeners, this was insightful. Please let us know if you have any questions. I can always direct them towards Joe. And I also just want to thank you for having this conversation. It's something I believe we should have more of these kind of conversations in our society. So thank you for making the time to be here today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
And is there any way that people can follow you or your thoughts on this and maybe other topics?
In fact, it gives me great pleasure to be able to say to you that I'm part of the problem, that actually I don't do social media for various reasons of anxiety. So unfortunately they can't. But if people want to, to contact me, if they would be able to do so through you, I'd be happy to, to respond. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you know what they say, wisdom starts always with self-knowledge, right? Of yourself. So I guess,
yeah.
Thank you so much. And of course, I also want to really thank all our listeners. If you want to make these kind of conversations possible, please consider subscribing at nieuwrechts.nl. And I guess I will see you in the next one.
Thank you.